Right now, I'm happy to say that we are going to have this lovely lecture. I'm going to now pin Tom, so he's all you see, not me. And I'm going to step aside and let Tom begin. You're on.
Go time, folks. First of all, let me apologize for not being there in person. This is a problem when you invite an 81-year-old geezer to your affairs, is sometimes medical problems happen. Things are improving, but not enough so that I could come. But I'm delighted to be able to talk to you anyway. I'm sorry I missed meeting you, many of you, in person, which I wanted to do. I want to thank Roseanne for asking me to do this. And I want to thank the techies at Stevens University for setting this up. When Roseanne and I started talking about this several years ago about my coming, we were trying to decide what I ought to talk about. And she finally decided about a year or two ago that it should be the foundations of screenwriting research. And I got to thinking about that and realized that when I started backing into becoming a film historian, I was a graduate student at UCLA studying screenwriting. And I'd written stage plays and I'd written a bunch of screenplays, and none of them have ever been produced. But when I was working on my MFA at UCLA, I got involved in a project called the Oral History of the Motion Pictures Project, set up by Howard Suber, who was a professor there. And the idea was that he would select graduate students who would go out and do oral history interviews with people who were established in the business. And I ended up doing an oral history with Nunnally Johnson. And the obvious thing to do if you're researching a screenwriter is you go to a book and you get a filmography of what he wrote. The problem was this was 1968 then, and there were no books that had filmographies in them. It's unheard of at the time. So the question is, and there was no IMDb, and we could argue about IMDb, but there was none. So how to do a filmography in 1968. There had been a trade paper called Film Daily in Hollywood, and every year they did a Film Daily yearbook. And UCLA's library had copies of Film Daily yearbook. So I spent several days, a couple of weeks, going through 30 years or more of Film Daily yearbook to create a filmography. It took a while. So I then did the oral history with Nunnally Johnson. The project was overseen by the UCLA Oral History department, office, whatever. And their guideline for doing an oral history was try to do 11 hours of interviews with your subject, not all in one time, but over 2 or 3, 4 meetings. They were we should aim for 11 hours. Nunnally Johnson and I talked for 23 and a half hours over a 6-month period. He had lots of interesting stuff to say, and I understood instinctively the basic guidelines, if you like, for doing an oral history interview. One is you do as much research as possible about the person you're talking to, which does 2 things. One, it convinces them that you're serious. And the second thing is it means they're less likely to lie to you if they know that you have a lot of information about them. The other thing I learned is that in an oral history interview, sit down, ask you a question, and then shut the hell up. An oral history interview is not a conversation. It's getting this important person to talk. Nobody cares what I say. They care what Nunnally Johnson says. So we did 23 and a half hours, and it's a transcript that looks like this. It's thick, 400 and so odd pages. That looks like about the size of a book, doesn't it? And that occurred to me, we could get this published as a book. Because a couple of years before, Francois Truffaut had brought out his book of interviews with Hitchcock. And I figured if they can do it, we can do it. I forgot two crucial things. Nunnally had not directed Psycho, and I had not directed The 400 Blows, or Jules and Jim either, for that matter. So when we went to publishers, they said, no, we don't want to do that. But some of them said, but we'd like to buy the research and hire a writer and to do a biography of Johnson. And aside from the fact that the research wasn't mine to sell, I didn't want to bother with that. Why don't we just do the book of interviews? And nobody responded positively to that. I at one point had an agent, Stuart, a nice guy. I've had, by the way, 5 agents in the course of my writing career, and none of them have ever sold a single thing I've written. Everything I've sold, I've done myself. Not only that, but 2 of the agents did things that hurt my career. One of them did it deliberately, and she went on to become a movie producer. Welcome to Hollywood, children. So, Stuart was one of the nice agents, and he called me up one day, and he'd been talking to a producer, get out of the Hollywood mode, he's talking to a publisher in New York, and made the pitch about the Q&A book. And the guy said, no, but what we'd like to do is buy the research so we can hire a writer. And Stuart, bless his heart, thinking like an agent, said, well, why don't you hire Tom to do the book? He's done the research. He did the oral history. He knows Nunnally Johnson. He would be the perfect choice. And the publisher said, and this is how Stuart said that he said it, oh no, we want to hire a professional writer. And I had to laugh at that. And this was 1971 when the Olympic Games were all amateurs, and Avery Brundage was very serious about that. And I said to Stuart, I'm perfectly willing to turn pro. I'm perfectly willing to take money. They do not have Olympic Games for writers. If I take money, Avery Brundage will not come down and smite me. And Stuart and I got a big laugh about that, but we agreed that that wouldn't work out with the publisher. I had avoided the idea of me writing a biography of Nunnally for a very simple reason. My prose was awful. My prose was bad in high school, it was bad in college, it was bad as in graduate school. I thought that I was much better at writing dialogue and structure for plays and screenplays. So I wanted to avoid that, but I began to think about it. Do I really want to hand over my baby to somebody that I don't know, that I can't trust? And I began to think about, well, I should, maybe I should do this. Well, the first thing to do in a case like that is talk to Nunnally Johnson. So I went up and talked to Nunnally, explained the situation, and said, how would you feel about me writing your biography? And if he had said no, I would not be sitting here talking to you today. If he had said, no, I would prefer a more experienced writer, that's a polite way of saying what the publisher said in an impolite way. If he'd said no to that or insisted on that, I wouldn't be here sitting to you today. He did not. Nunnally said, I would be honored if you would. Well, if Nunnally Johnson says he would be honored if you write his biography, you damn well better write his biography. So I said, okay, how am I going to do this? And I talked to Howard Suber, my mentor, and Howard thought it was a great idea. Yeah, go ahead, you should do that. Right. Okay, that's 2 people. And about a week later, Howard called, and he had been talking to an editor in New York. And the editor said, without any prompting from Howard, you know, I always thought there ought to be a book about Nunnally Johnson. And Howard, I assume, said something on the order of, have I got a guy for you? So he put me in touch with the editor, and the editor asked what editors always do. They want a synopsis of the book and some sample chapters to show that you could write. Synopsis I could do easily. Sample chapters, I was going to sweat blood. But I've now got a support team of 4. Nunnally Johnson, Howard Suber, an editor who's waiting for the chapters, and my wife. My wife was a scientist rather than a movie historian, but she was very encouraging. I was complaining one day that I was having trouble writing one of these sample chapters. I didn't know if I could do it, all of that. I went back into the study, this very room, in fact, and sat down and started writing again I was writing the book on a Royal manual typewriter. Did not have an electric typewriter then. My wife got me an electric typewriter after my first book came out. Anyway, so I'm writing there, and my wife goes into the bedroom, goes into the cupboards, and she gets out my high school letterman sweater. For those of you that don't know American high schools, for athletes, when they do really well, or well enough anyway, they get awarded their letter. It means you can wear a sweater around campus. In the case of my school, it was a red sweater with a big U because it was University High School on it. And I'd won mine for cross country. And anyway, my wife dug it out, put it on, so she looked like a cheerleader. And I'm sitting there typing, and she bounces into the room and says, "Write that chapter, write that chapter, write that chapter," and bounces out. Now, my wife was not a bouncy person. I only saw her bounce like this twice, once on this occasion, and the other when her former boss won the Nobel Prize for that they'd done in their lab. She's on the papers that helped win him the Nobel Prize. Normally, she was not a bouncy sort of person. So I go back to writing, and what I always say about writing the Nunnally Johnson book, it's the book on which I taught myself how to write readable prose. And that sounds very easy, and it's not, and I was sweating blood. I finished the sample chapters and the synopsis, and I sent them off to the editor. Got back a very nice note from the editor saying, "I love it. I'm going to pitch it to the editorial board." This publisher was what they call a trade publisher. They do commercial books. And the methodology there is the various editor will get a project, will collect the material, give it to the editorial board, and the editorial board will make a judgment on it, whether they want to do it or not. So this went to the editorial board, and the editorial board said no. And it was not even a close vote. It was not one of those 9-4 votes we used to get on the Supreme Court. Nobody on the editorial board wanted to do this book. And the editor was very apologetic to me. We didn't discuss why they didn't. But if you read enough of my stuff, you know that the East Coast intellectual establishment, after the movies moved onward, East Coast intellectual establishment became very condescending towards screenwriting and screenwriters. And I think what happened was this was a New York publisher. The people on the editorial board were part of that world that just believed that screenwriting and screenwriters weren't worth writing about. And there were not any of them other than the editor who wanted to say yes. That sort of thing happened a lot. That's changed, as we will talk about. So now I've got these sample chapters and I don't have a publisher, and what am I going to do? Well, back in the summer of 1971, it was a busy year. Howard Suber called me up and said, "I want you to be my guinea pig." I said, "Say what?" And some of what he told me I already knew. At that point, UCLA did not have a PhD in film history. They had a PhD in theater history, and you could take film courses and theater courses, and then you could write your dissertation on film, but you got your PhD in theater history. It's what Howard had done and some other people had done. Howard had finally convinced everybody concerned, except for some retrograde theater people, that there ought to be a film PhD at UCLA. And he needed somebody to be the first person to do that. And I was his choice. And I asked him decades later, why did you pick me for that? And he said, I can't remember. Anyway, so do I want to do this? My answer is no. Howard, no. My plate is full. I'm writing this book. I'm finishing up stuff I was doing at the AFI. I'm about ready to start teaching at LACC, and I have to organize a course, which I have never done before. No. We talked for a little while longer, and I finally said, Howard, I will make a deal with you. I will do the PhD for you if I can use the book as my dissertation, provided that we understand it's a book first. And Howard said, sure. One of the things I love about Howard is he's very casual about very serious stuff. If I had messed up, it wouldn't have hurt my career. I had no career. It would have hurt his career. It might have screwed up the idea of having a PhD in film. It could have been a mess. Howard was willing to take the chance. I came through for him. Now, that my comment about it's a book first. I never had to explain this to Howard, but the gist of it was this. Nunnally Johnson was one of the great wits in Hollywood. And there are a lot of funny stories that he told and funny things that he said, and I wanted those in the book. Normally, you don't get a lot of laughs out of a dissertation. But Howard didn't object to that. The people on my PhD committee, reading the dissertation, none of them objected that. And we got through it. So I began to think, well, I'm doing a PhD now for the University of California, Los Angeles, UCLA. And I know that the University of California has a university press, an academic press. And it makes sense that this should be published by them. Probably every PhD student thinks that, but anyway, I thought it. And I contacted Chick Callenbach, an editor at the UC Press, and gave them the sample chapters, and I got a contract from them to do the book. It was a limited contract because an academic press is different. There's one additional step that they do. The editor finds the project, and then they send 2 copies of the manuscript to 2 different people who are established in the field, and they read and report on it, and they say, yes, you should publish it. No, you shouldn't. In theory, if the 2 readers say you should publish it, they will. Years later, I had a book project in an academic press. Both readers loved it, thought they ought to publish it. But the marketing department at the academic press said, we don't know how to sell this. And so the editorial board, the editorial board said no. I subsequently found another publisher. It got published. It's still in print. It's still making money. I still get royalties from it. So that was the contract I had from the university press. So now I had other research to do. I interviewed Nunnally and additional stuff, his family, his friends, people he worked with. But the one thing that I wasn't able to get to were scripts that he had written when he was at 20th Century Fox. He spent most of his career at 20th Century Fox. And the scripts that had not been produced, he did not have copies of. He had copies of the ones that had been produced. So the ones that were unproduced were at Fox. And in those days, the studios had everything locked up in the studios, and they were not open to people coming in and look at it. Well, to 20th Century Fox, who do I know at 20th Century Fox? Nobody. Do I know anybody who knows anybody at 20th Century Fox? This is Hollywood. It's not what you know, it's who you know. Yes, I do. Howard Suber, of course. Howard was setting up the UCLA Film Archive and trying to get prints from 20th Century Fox to take the prints over to the archive. He talked to people who talked to people, and they set up a deal. I could come in to the studio, provided I call an executive, a particular executive at Fox, the day before I was going to come to let him know so that I would be on the printed list that they handed to the guards at the gate of people who were allowed on the lot the next day. I said, oh, okay, it makes sense to me. So I get ready to do this, and I call the guy, and he says, yes, tomorrow, fine. Okay. I drive up to the gate. I'm on the printed list. The guard says, yes, Mr. Stempel, certainly go on in. The building you want, the Corporate Record Center, is down there. You can park there. Okay. I drive on in, and I'm feeling so cool. I'm driving on the lot at 20th Century Fox. Anyway, I find the building. It's a repurposed soundstage that they had turned into the Corporate Record Center. And you go in a door on the skinny end of the studio, or the soundstage, and there's a desk, and behind the desk is the office of Jack Yeager, who supervises the record center. And I go in, introduce myself. He knows that I'm coming. I explain a lot about what I'm doing, and he says, fine. I don't have to fill out any more papers. I don't have to fill out any cards or anything, wait for anything. He says, go through this door. The scripts are on the left. The corporate business records are on the right. I go in the door, and here are the files stretching to the ceiling almost of the scripts. Over there is the business records. Who cares about them? And I go and I find the unproduced scripts. One morning when I went in, I happened to notice up at the corner where the files of the scripts stored. They had scripts going back to the 1910s when William Fox started making movies. I died and gone to heaven. Anyway, I'm working over a period of several days. I'm working full-time at LACC at this point, and I can't come in every day, but I come in every few days, call the guy up, yeah, go in. After a couple of weeks of this, Jack Yeager says to me one day, Tom, you don't have to call the executive. Anytime you want to come in, even if it's on the same day, give me a call and I will call the front gate. Wow. I took that to mean, and I think Jack took it to mean, that I had the run of the place. So I finish up looking at the unproduced scripts. Come in any day. I start looking at the scripts and stuff for films of Nunnally's that I'm writing about in great detail. And I find all kinds of useful stuff. And the classic one was Darryl Zanuck had claimed in a biography of him that he had written the final scene of The Grapes of Wrath. And Nunnally said that he hadn't. And what I found in the Fox files was the copy of Nunnally's first draft that had gone to Darryl, that Darryl had made handwritten notes on. I recognized the handwriting. And the final scene is in the script as written by Nunnally Johnson. I put that in the book. I've had to put it in a couple of books to get people to recognize that fact. So eventually I've gone through a number of these files, and I'm standing at the door, sort of where you go out, and I'm looking at the files and I'm thinking, well, are there any other films that I want? You remember the stuff over on the right, the business files? Whoosh! I found all kinds of interesting stuff in the business files, some of which I put in the book, some of which I couldn't because it's sort of libelous, but lots of good stuff. So finally, I finish up with that. I've told you about that, and I made it sound like it was a lot of fun, and it was an enormous amount of fun just to go in, look at the scripts you want, so on. I love doing it, and you can't do it anymore because since then, that was in the early 70s, since then, virtually every studio in town has donated their script files, business files in some cases, to the various research libraries. So the Fox files went to USC, which also has the MGM story files, the Warner Brothers files. The Herrick Library, the Academy Library has the Paramount Story files. UCLA has the RKO files. UCLA also ended up with the Fox business file. I don't know if UCLA and USC flipped a coin as to that one, but anyway, the business files at UCLA. And that is a good thing, much as I enjoyed running around unchained in the Fox files. It's a good thing because it means that that material, the scripts, treatments, memos, are available to film scholars such as your own good selves. Yes, you have to fill out a lot of paperwork and all of that, and sometimes you have to wait a day or two before they get the stuff and the thing, but it's available to you. You know, the official title of this lecture is The Foundations of Screenwriting Research. One of the major foundations of screenwriting research is that material is now available. And not only in this country, in other countries as well, libraries are collecting that kind of stuff. I've done that. I finished the first draft of the book, and I call up Chick Calabac, the editor at University of California Press, and say, Chick, I have the first draft of my first book, and could you take a look at it and just give me a sense if I'm on the right track? This is not to be sent out to readers. This is the first draft. You could look it over. And he says, sure. So I sent it off, and I'm busy. I'm teaching full time. I'm doing my PhD, rigmarole, and all of that. And I don't hear from him for a while. He doesn't hear from me, or I don't hear from him. He doesn't hear from me. Finally, I call him up, and now in the school year in '74, and I say, Chick, I'm getting ready to write the final draft of the book, and I didn't get any notes from you, and could I get something? And he says, oh, the first reader loved it. I said, wait a minute, it wasn't supposed to go out to readers. And he says, that's okay, because the first reader loved it, and I know the second reader is going to love it. Okay. Sure enough, 2 weeks later, he calls me. The second reader not only did not love it, but disliked it in such virulent terms that Chick said, even if I get a third reader to read it, which would be the standard process, and he likes it, the editorial board would look at all the stuff and look at these comments from the second reader, and I could never get this past the editorial board. So 2 down, more publishers to go. It was eventually turned down by over 30 publishers, most of them twice at various stages of development. I won't go into all those details. That's a whole nother hour lecture, 2 hours actually. Finally, the book was published in 1980. And 3 things about that. One is, one of the gentlemen on my PhD committee said to me one day, Tom, you know, this is the most readable dissertation I've ever read. And then he stopped and he thought for a minute and he said, now don't get a swelled head. That's because most of them are terribly written. And he's right. Academic writing tends to be awful. My feeling, and I started out with this feeling when I started doing the book, if you are going to write about a writer and about a writer whom you like and admire, you had better write as well as you possibly can, just to honor the person you're writing about. The other reason why you want to write it really well is the better you write it, the more people will read it, will want to read it. Okay, that was one thing. Second thing was the first line of the first review of my first book was, this is a model on how to write about a screenwriter. And that struck a chord with me. I realized I was doing something the first time, writing a book about a screenwriter that really focused on being a screenwriter. I was hoping there were going to be people who would come along after me and do that, and there have been. So I wanted to encourage people about the work that they do. And that leads to a lot of stuff, including my coming here, sitting at home, talking to you today about that. That's part of my teacher thing. The third thing about the book was that one of the history professors, just a regular, ordinary, everyday history professor, not a film professor, said when I was writing the book, Tom, you've got a lot of information about Nunnally Johnson's career, but you might want to do something that puts it in the context of the history of the movies. And I thought, that's a good idea. So what I did is in the introduction to the book, I wrote a mini history of screenwriting. And as I'm writing that, one day, kaboom, the light bulb, in the cartoon goes on over the head. Maybe I could write a book, a whole book, on the history of screenwriting in the American film. That was the beginnings of what became Framework. So I had finished the Nunnally Johnson biography. I started to work on what became Framework. First thing I wondered was, is there going to be enough material for a whole book on the history of screenwriting? That sounds silly now, but I didn't know, but nobody else knew, nobody else had done this. But I began to read and discovered there was a lot of stuff that had been published about screenwriting that film historians had generally ignored. So there was a bunch of that previously published material that was in the book, which led some critics, academic types and others, to say, there's not enough original research in this book. Academia loves original research. That's the silver chalice of academic research, the holy grail, one of those things, is do original research. At the risk of completely blowing your minds, let me tell you this. Academia hates original research unless it confirms what they already think they know. I am the poster boy for this. I could spend another 2 hours on examples of that, of my running into problems with people who said, oh, no, I don't believe that, whatever it is. Anyway, you should keep that in mind, that you write. As long as you write something that's original research, but confirms what they already know, then you're okay. I wasn't. I was saying, hey, the writers did this rather than the directors. Okay, but I also looked at research material in libraries. I spent a bunch of time in a lot of libraries. The chief one was the Margaret Herrick Library, the Academy Library. It was then not in that wondrous space that they have now in La Cienega, but in the Academy building on Wilshire. And it was a nice, cozy little place. But we all love the new spot. As one film historian said, the only thing wrong with it is they don't serve coffee. And he's got a point there. Anyway, I was working in a smaller building in the 70s. And one of the things you do is you tell the people in the library, the people who are running it, what you're doing. And there's something, librarians, I think, come equipped with a helpful gene. They love to help people do stuff and find stuff. And so once the word gets around in the library that this guy is doing this, people tell you stuff. And the classic example of that was on this book. I came in one day and one of the guys came up to me and he said, down in the basement, we have several boxes of screenplays from the Max Sennett studio. And I nearly fell on the floor. Boxes of screenplays from the studio of Mac. Oh, we don't have any scripts. We just made up as we went along. Sennett. And I was just sort of gobsmacked and I didn't say anything. He said, would you want to look at those? Yeah, I think I would. Now, at this point, I had two sources of information about the Senate studios. One was Max Sennett's autobiography, which he wrote or told to another guy to write in 1954, called The Candid Comedy. It was the second film book I ever bought as a kid. I loved it. But he makes very little mention of writers and mostly describes them as gag writers coming up with the jokes. And the implication is there is no screenwriting going on at the Senate studios. But the other source of information was from a book written in the 1930s by Gene Fowler called Father Goose, which was a biography of Senate done early on. And Gene, I'm on a first name basis with Gene, although I never met him. He's part of the Nunnally Johnson family. His son, Gene Jr., married Marge Johnson, and they lived happily ever after. Anyway, Gene Sr. wrote this book. He knew writers. He wrote biographies. He was a screenwriter. And in his book, Father Goose, there's a bit about screenwriters, and not a little bit. A very large chunk of the book is about the screenwriting that went on at the Senate studios. I tended to feel at the time that Gene was more accurate than Senate was. So we get the boxes, and what I discover is, on the one hand, they do confirm what Gene Fowler had written. On the other hand, they went way beyond it. For example, not only are the scripts in there, but the treatments. Who knew that they wrote treatments at the Max Sennett's studios? Production reports that list the days spent on various things. And the top line is scripts, the time that they used writing the scripts, which were often longer than the time they used shooting the film. Scripts. They had a space for rehearsals. Who knew the Senate studios rehearsed? And then they have space after that for additional writing when they did revisions. There was a whole lot more writing going on at the Senate studios than the Senate had said. Senate did say, it's just sort of a throwaway line, that at one point they brought in a court stenographer to write down the gags that the writers came up with. In the boxes were the steno tapes that go through the machine and the transcripts. And they were transcripts of complete story conferences. And you can read that and see them working on the story. This all was solid gold. I did an article about this published in Sight and Sound 2 years before the book came out. The book came out in '88, had the section on Senate and the writing that went on in Senate. I defy you to find me a film history book written after, say, 1990 that says that at Senate studios they didn't have writers and they just made it up as they went along. That's a piece of research that has fit. Okay, it actually worked. So I eventually get the book written and turn it in, and I had at this point a absolutely wonderful editor, the best book editor I've ever had, Mike Leach. And I turned in framework. And most editors at that point would say something like, well, if you ever have another idea for a book, you might want to let us know, and we would think about considering. Mike was not like that. Mike said, what are you going to write for us next? Ooh, you love to hear that from an editor. Well, I said, when I'd started working on framework, I knew that I had the 3 parts that now exist. I thought if I didn't have enough really to fill them out, I would add another section on writing for television. And I ended up, of course, not using that. What I want to do next is a book on the history of television writing. And he said, as editors tend to, okay, do a synopsis and some sample chapters. He said, Mike, I can do a synopsis of the kinds of things I'm going to write about, but I haven't done the research yet, so I can't do sample chapters. And after a very gratifyingly short pause, Mike said, well, just do the synopsis. You don't need to do the chapters. We know you can write. That's confidence that you get from a good editor. So I began to do the research. Now, with what became Storytellers of the Nation. In this case, there was virtually no writing about television before. There was some material in files at UCLA and USC, but I realized that the basic foundation of this book was going to be interviews with writers, because there were writers at that time who had started in television in the 40s and the early 50s and were still around. So I would have to do those. Anyway, I sat down and I was writing the synopsis for Mike. I was saying, I want to do this. And of course, I'm going to write about this. And I'm going to do this. And I get through to the 80s. I was writing this in 89. And I get up through the 80s, Hill Street Blues, Children of Hill Street. And I think, no, is there anything else that I want to put into the book? And I'm sitting there with my fingers on the keyboard. I have a computer by this time. My wife eventually dragged me into using computers. I was sitting there with my hands on the computer thinking, what else do I want to do? And I suddenly feel it's like an electric current running up my forearms into my hands. And my hands start typing, and up on the screen comes, and the final chapter will be about women television writers. Where the hell did that come from? Certainly not from the conscious mind. The only thing I can think of is that when I was doing framework, I wanted to avoid ghettoizing women screenwriters. I didn't want to have little chapters. The ladies auxiliary. Here's some women screenwriters. Now let's get back to the real ones, the guys. So I included women screenwriters just as part of the book, which is a great idea. I wasn't altogether happy with the results. There were a lot of writers, male and female, that I didn't get into framework. It astonishes me to this day. Somehow I managed to do framework without ever mentioning Roberttown and Chinatown. I don't know how I did that, but it happened. Anyway, I was looking at that final chapter on women television writers. Could that be so? People are going to question that, and I don't have any answers for that. So the first line was from the subconscious. The second line was very much from the conscious mind, and it was, I don't yet know why this is so. I just know that it is. And nobody ever questioned it, ever, along the process. The problem was then that meant changing the whole structure of the book. My original synopsis was just a basic chronological list. If you're going to have a book that ends with the women writers, you've got to build to that. I compare it to writing a mystery novel. You know the butler did it, you have to lay in the clues so we will believe the butler did it. You have to lay in the red herrings so that we think the butler didn't do it, and so we do. So that changes the structure of the book so that it leads to that chapter. And that changes a lot in the book. So I got the book done, and we were ready to bring it out. And one of the things you do as you get ready to publish a book is you send the manuscript out to get comments that you can use as blurbs on the back of the book. And one of the people we sent it to was Eric Barnow, who was the dean of broadcast historians, did a 3-volume history of broadcasting, a single-volume history of television. He's a guy you'd like to get a blurb from. And I had a new editor by this time. Mike had moved on, and his mentee, Evander Lamke, was now taking over. I got a call one day from Evander, and he says, "We got this blurb from Eric Barnow. Let me read it to you." And he starts to read it. And it's one of the greatest blurbs I've ever read, the greatest blurb I ever got. What I could tell from Evander's voice is that he hadn't really believed that the book was this good. I mean, you can just tell from his voice. Anyway, it was a great blurb. So the book came out in the fall of '92, and with this great blurb by Eric Barnow on the back. In January of '93, the book got a good review in the New York Times. Everybody connected with this book was gobsmacked at that. A review in the New York Times, which traditionally hates television, about people who write for television, and it's a good review. Nobody knows how that happened, but it did. And I thought, oh, this is going to be terrific. This is going to create a lot of sales because it's a good review in the New York Times. It's going to cause other newspapers and magazines, things, to write a review of it, because they figure if the New York Times is writing a review of it, then we ought to. Didn't happen. There was one paper, small town paper in Connecticut, that had a review of it that was sort of similar to the New York Times review. I think the writer was trying to impress the New York Times so they get a job there or something. And there were no sales, no sales, but very few copies were sold. From all of that, from the Barnow comment to the blurb to the New York Times review, the sales were so bad of the hardcover edition that Continue and the publisher said, no, we're not going to do a paperback edition. Evander, the editor, who's a really nice guy, said, okay, Tom, what you should do is go to Syracuse University Press, because they're doing a series of books on television, because Syracuse University has the Annenberg School of Media. And see if they're interested. So I approached them, and their reaction was, yeah, we'll do it. Not enormous enthusiasm. So they did it, and the paperback edition, and they gave what I call a B picture budget. Here's a copy of the book. And I don't know if you could tell, but that background color on the front cover is a color that I call Linda Blair pea soup vomit green. If you've seen The Exorcist, you know the color. And then instead of pictures of people, they have these drawings by what I take to be about a 3-year-old. They're obviously a talented 3-year-old, not a 3-year-old. And some of them you recognize right away, the Lone Ranger. You get down here to this couple down here. I still don't know who they are. I think it's supposed to be Bill Cosby and Felicia Rashad, the Cosby Show, but I don't know. Anyway, so pea soup vomit, 3-year-old drawings. On the back, there's a word from the New York Times, or from a quote from the review, because they're on the East Coast and they got to suck up to the New York Times. You have a chunk here then of text. Is this the Eric Barnow blurb? It is not. It is from a memo that the original publisher did, and it is filled with errors and misleading statements. So that's the paperback. Pea soup vomit, 3-year-old drawing, sucking up to the New York Times, and lies and misleading statements. Book came out in '96, and it sold, and it sold, and it's still selling, and I still occasionally get royalties from it, not every year, but occasionally. But the interesting thing is that it never really caught on in the same way that Framework did. When I was working on Framework and told people what I was doing, writing a history of screenwriting in the American film, I got one of two reactions. The first reaction was, it's about time somebody did that. The second reaction was, you mean nobody's done that before? And I say, no. They'd say, well, it's about time somebody did that. So it was an idea whose time had come. Okay, with storytellers, I had seen in the 80s the maturation of television, and I had picked up on that in the book. But typical of the reactions I got from people when I told them I was writing history of television writing was from Howard Suber. Typical Howard comment: was there any? Meaning, was there any worth writing a book about? And he suspected, of course, that I knew that there was. But it suggested this was not an idea whose time had come. So when it came out, it eventually started to sell in '96. I was thinking it might click. It didn't, because of what happened in 1999. And we all know what happened in 1999. Okay, if there are any of you that don't know what happened in 1999, let me do this right, give it an importance. In 1999, The Sopranos revolutionized television. There was no great television before The Sopranos. There was not even a good television before The Sopranos. Okay, I always had some funny stuff in my head, good episodes, but The Sopranos changed everything. The most polite thing I can say to that is nonsense. The Sopranos did not revolutionize television. The revolution that people attribute to The Sopranos really comes from HBO, which puts The Sopranos on, give them credit for that. But HBO realized as a cable system, they did not have to follow the FCC guidelines, Federal Communications Guidelines, for what went over the public airwaves, because they went on the public airwaves. And they figured they could be a lot raunchier and tougher and more violent. And you see that in The Sopranos. But what's interesting is The Sopranos came out in 1999, and the year before, HBO put on Sex and the City. My feeling is you can make a better case for Sex and the City being revolutionary, or at least evolutionary, than The Sopranos. But male critics, almost exclusively male critics, loved The Sopranos, and it's sort of sucked the air out of discussion about television writing for a number of years. So I think that's one of the reasons why storytellers never quite caught on in the same way that Framework did, although it's used in television courses. I know there are lots of people that read it. Okay. In 1994, I got a flyer from Eric Barnow, who was starting a journal called Creative Screenwriting. In its early days, Creative Screenwriting was a journal, very like sort of a forerunner of journal of screenwriting, academic pieces, serious writing about screenwriting. And anyway, the flyer announced what this was, and you could subscribe to it. I said, yeah, let me support this. I will subscribe to this. And so I subscribed and got the first issue, and I'm looking through it. And boy, do they need a copy editor to find the mistakes in here. They need a fact checker because they get some things wrong. But their heart is in the right place, and they're starting. And I was flipping through, and I come to a page, and the top page, half of the page, is an ad. They are looking for people to join the editorial board of the journal. I fell out of my chair, given all the troubles I've had with editorial boards over the years, and I only scratched the surface on the ones I told you about. I thought I really should be on an editorial board where I can help support writers. So I sent off my CV, and I was on the editorial board for 14 years. And part of my job, particularly in the early years of that, was encouraging writers they would write stuff and I would email them, or I got to the point where I was doing notes on the galleys, and I would comment on somebody did a particularly nice job of writing, and Eric or Dan Schumann, who took over as editor, would let the writers know and they would be happy. And so we supported writers. There are at least a couple of books that came out of those early years that had material that appeared first in creative screenwriting. One of them, which I'm sure you all know, is Carrie Beecham's Without Lying Down, one of the best of the screenwriter biographies. So that got me into not only on the editorial board, but also helping other writers, reading manuscripts for people, eventually reading manuscripts for academic presses. I've read a bunch of those for academic presses. Get the, do the report, encourage the ones that ought to be published, discourage the ones that shouldn't. That was doing the helping. The other thing that I got into in 2008, I started writing an online column called Understanding Screenwriting, which was the first of its kind, but then I've been doing first of its kind all my life. What I do in the column is review movies and television from the standpoint of screenwriting. I've been doing that since 2008. I'm still doing it. It's at scriptmag.com. And I not only review movies and TV, I also review books about screenwriting and so on. It's part of the encouragement that I do to other writers. So far as I know, there's only one other person who's done anything like it. And the last time I looked at some of the stuff he wrote, it was not really reviewing screenwriting. So I'm still first on that. Okay, one more story, and then I promise I will shut up. This shows you the changes in the situation for screenwriting and writing about screenwriting and so on. About 15 years ago, I was in touch with a young historian, film historian now, Jennifer Smith. You may have read some of her books. She signs them J.E. Smith. Why she signs them with initials, I don't know. This is the 21st century. Women don't have to do that, but she does. Anyway, never ask her why. Her first book, which was her PhD at Yale, the first PhD at Yale, by the way, in the mid-2000s, but finally catching up in the world, was a book called Reconstructing American Historical Cinema. And it was about American historical films from the 1930s. She had started out as an historian before she got into film, but this was a project that dealt with history and dealt with how it's portrayed in films. And Jennifer she hates me using the term for it, but Jennifer's an archive rat. She got into the archives for the studios and discovered that the people who were most concerned about the historical aspects of the film were not the directors, not the producers, but the writers. And she made a point of that in the book, and she still got it past her PhD committee, which had a couple of real tourists on the committee. Anyway, she did the book. I had seen it. I liked it a lot, not only because she quoted from my stuff on Nunnally Johnson, but because she paid attention to writers. And we were in touch, and her next book was going to be a collection of essays by a variety of writers about historical films. And she knew I had written about Nunnally Johnson, so she said, could you write a piece on Darryl F. Zanuck, the head of studio at 20th Century Fox, as a producer of historical films? I said, sure, I could do that, because Nunnally had some very funny stuff about Darrell's attitude toward history. I also had, from an oral history I'd done with Philip Dunn, the AFI, a lot of Phil's quotes. And Phil was really funny on Zanuck and his attitude toward history. So I sat down, I wrote the first draft, and I emailed it off to Jennifer, and She had some kernels and sent it back, and I fixed them up and I sent her the second draft. Now, if you learn nothing else from everything I tell you today, learn this one essential fact. Never, never, ever, ever turn anything in early. It gives too many people a chance to muck it up. And it wasn't Jennifer's fault this time. The project she was working on had the same kind of deal with a lot of projects like this. Jennifer was the editor of the book and was collecting the stuff and approving the stuff. But then it would go to the publisher and they would have a reader who would approve or not approve. And the publisher always says, you know, it's a formality. They'll approve it. If you like it, they'll approve it. Article to come in. And Jennifer sent it to the publisher. And the reader for the publisher did not like the article at all. And what he really didn't like, although he never said this outright, was the fact that I was quoting from screenwriters. He just felt totally uncomfortable with that. And he just didn't like it. And Jennifer and I wrote back an email back and forth about this. And we agreed that there wasn't much point in me doing a rewrite, because if I rewrote it in the way that he wanted it done, anybody could do that. That was below my pay grade. You know, for my pay grade, you get quotes from guys who were in the room where it happens with Daryl Zanuck, listening to Daryl talk about it. As you may gather from this, I have a gigantic ego. Anyway, so we decided it wasn't worth it to do anything. I was then corresponding with my friend, my Irish friend Elaine, who does stuff on spec. And she said, where can you suggest that I can send this? This is an Australian journal. And I did, but she warned me that they never respond to anything. She had sent a thing and it was there for a year and she didn't hear from him. Finally, one day gets a call, says, we're posting it tomorrow. Have you got any changes that you want to make? I said, okay, I don't want to be bothered by any of this stuff. So I sent it off. I didn't hear from him. Months go by, I didn't hear from him. A year goes by, I didn't hear from him. Several months go by. One day I'm at my computer, I'm at a break between things, and I said, I'll do a Google vanity search. I don't know if you've done a Google vanity search. You put your name in the box and hit enter. Roseanne is nodding there. Yes, we've all done it. And it's very interesting. You learn interesting things about yourself, some of which are even true. Anyway, so this day I put it in and clicked, and one of the things that pops up is the Census of Cinema article. It's been posted, and I click on it, and it's there, and they have nice pictures and everything like that. It's great. So I emailed to Jennifer and tell her that it's got published there. And she said, more people are going to read that online than in this book. She was not having a good experience with this, horrible experience. She never worked with him again. So that's what happened. Are you ready now for the punchline to this story, folks? The punchline is the publisher whose reader turned it down, has had too much screenwriting, and that did the book with Jennifer was Palgrave Macmillan. They are the ones that are now doing a series of books on screenwriting with the organization there, the Screenwriting Research Network, and others. I realized, I should mention, I have no idea when or how Palgrave Macmillan had their, what they call out there in the Midwest, their come to Jesus moment, when they understood that there are books to be written and published about screenwriting. I don't know how that happened. I had nothing to do with it, as far as I know. I think there are people in the room with you guys that had something to do with that. I didn't, but they did. And now I realized, okay, they had made that change from we don't want anything to do with screenwriters to doing books about screenwriters. And I realized that what has happened is that there is now a whole set of critical masses. There are a critical mass of people who are studying and writing about screenwriting. You know, if we'd had a meeting like you're having now, when I started with people who were writing about screenwriting, it would have been me and Janet Steger in a room, and that would have been it. Now there are people all over the world, I don't know where all you guys come from, but all over the world, that are doing this. That's the foundation for screenwriting research all by itself. By the way, if you were expecting me to give you 10 lists of foundations of screenwriting, I'm not going to do it because I don't know what they are. Anyway, there are also the publishers who are willing to publish it. When I read something for somebody that doesn't have a publisher, I can usually guess within one or two publishers who's going to be able to publish it. I send them in that direction. There are journals that do it. In the next hour, I'm going to introduce you to Leslie Reiner Wilson, who won the article award this year, and her article appears in a journal called Film History, not screenwriting history, but film history. The other journals are willing to put that in. All that has changed. And as I realized this, I was thinking of the line that the great silent movie star Lena Lamont once said. Fans were going over about how they enjoyed her film, and she said, "It's nice to know our hard work ain't been in vain for nothing."
Yay, that's perfect.
Thank you. Thank you.